All right, so with this one, we're going to practice annotating. You can see I already wrote out the 3 different levels of annotation that you covered on your Canvas page. The first one is just comprehension. What is the story or the purpose of the poem? This would also be a time to look up words, phrases, context that might not be obvious. That's all going to be level 1 stuff, right? You're not going to be able to figure out what a poem is literally talking about if you don't know what some of the words or phrases mean. Like on this example, we have this Latin phrase, spiritus mundi. What's that mean? We're going to have to look that up. Level 2 is poetic devices and how the poet is using them. I believe you have a list of different poetic devices. Those are going to be the ones we're kind of looking for your ability to use. If you wanted to or felt like looking up more poetic devices, you definitely can. And something I always tell my students is, even if you don't know the fancy poetry word for it, you're still able to identify it, right? So if you don't remember that a stanza with 2 lines is called a couplet, but you can still identify that, oh, this poem is a collection of 2-line stanzas, that's fine. I'm not going to mark you down if you don't remember the specific poetry word. And then finally, level 3 is, hopefully we were able to come to a good conclusion about being and unbeing, something along the lines of, how we should live our life or what we should pay attention to versus unbeing, maybe if you like the David Foster Wallace video, something along the lines of unconsciousness or not paying attention or being self-centered, any of those things. So you can see I'm here in Cami. Some of your annotations, I believe, might take place through the annotating tool in Canvas, but I think they're pretty similar. If you're not able to highlight in the Canvas one, I think you're definitely able to just say like, oh, here's level 1, here's level 2, instead of color coding it. So this is a poem by William Butler Yeats. And it's just complex enough to where we really have to do some thinking about it, but we can still get something out of it. In the poem, I'll do a reading and then we'll just go level by level through the poem. The second coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed in everywhere, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out with a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Okay, so there are a couple of things going on in this poem. Let's start with level 1, the literal. So I'm going to use the markup tool to highlight things and the comment tool or text box tool to help me leave comments to hopefully explain myself a little bit. So turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. So a gyre is, right, a big spiral. So maybe I'll leave a little comment just defining words. So this is, I'll just do L1 for level 1, right? Gyre, like a spiral. So there's a bird flying away from a person, and the bird can't hear the person anymore. That's definitely going to be like a metaphor, but that kind of gets into level 2. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So things are going bad. The bird can't hear people, the person, Things are falling apart. Whatever the glue was, the center can't hold things anymore. And guess what happens? Your anarchy gets released on the world, right? Everything's falling apart. It's going to crap. So I guess if we keep using green here for the comments level 1, things are not great. They have completely crumbled. The blood-dimmed tide is loose, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. What a violent word right there, drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. That tells me, right, the people who might have done something about it are not doing it. Right, and this would be a time where we might look up the context of this poem, right? The Second Coming was written, I think, in response. I'm trying to, let's see, let's look at the year. The Second Coming, year 1920. So this would be in response, and Yeats, I believe, was an Irish poet, English or Irish, responding to the First World War. So that makes a lot of sense, right? The First World War was a very violent war. It was the first war where, you know, machine guns were used, where poisonous gas was used. It was a trench war, so you were dug into the mud, shooting blindly across what used to be fields of wheat. So this makes a lot of sense. Historically, that probably is a good chunk of what Yeats is responding to. Okay, so the first part of the poem, this first stanza, only 2 stanzas, is things are bad, and people who we hoped would fix it aren't able to fix it. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Okay, so now we get this religious language, right? You might have recognized, right, just by the title of the poem, the second coming is typically a way to talk about the second coming of Christ, Revelation being the book in the Bible that details the end of the world. So yeah, there's definitely relying heavily on that language, that religious language here. When a vast image out of spirituous movie. So now the poet seems to have a vision, right? So the book of Revelation is a prophecy given to this guy John, who's kind of trapped on an island, and he wrote it all down. So that's the book of Revelation. And here we see the poet is also having a similar kind of vision, right? Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi. Spiritus Mundi, I can write that down. Spiritus Mundi means spirit of the world, right? So so what does spirit of the world mean, right? Spiritus Mundi. And I could make a guess, but I want to model for you, just like you can Google stuff, right? What do I think of the muse whose role? I'll see it now. If you want to get fancy and right, don't let them do the work for you, but it's a famous poem. So you could always go and dig a little bit deeper, right? Collective spirit of humanity. And that's probably what our guess would have been, right? So he says, like, oh, all of humanity is kind of leading me toward this vision. In a desert, again, very like religious imagery coming out of the Abrahamic religions in the Middle East. A shape with a lion body and head of a man. Okay, so definitely religious imagery here, right? But also maybe some mythological. And if you're familiar with the book of Revelation, we see stuff like this A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs while all about it real shadows indignant desert birds. Okay, so a big monster is moving and followed by birds, right? And I'm thinking birds, this might be level 2, but right, typically when birds follow, it's to pick up all the I'm thinking bits of flesh, right? So if there's a war, the next morning, the battlefield will be swarmed with different birds who are there to get a free meal. So that's kind of how I'm seeing these birds here. And they're indignant. They're not going to apologize for what they are. The darkness drops again. So here the vision ends and he comes to this conclusion. Vision ends, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep. So 20 centuries, that's 2,000 years. So we think of our calendar. This poem was written at the beginning of the 20th century. Jesus is said to have died, at the year 30 or between the years 30 and 40 AD, or CE, Common Era. Vision ends. So that's what it's in reference to, right? This time from the death of Christ to the modern day. 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. So I'm curious what that rocking cradle is. Vision ends. What is the rocking cradle? Right? Is it war? Is it humanity's hubris? Is it some religious prophecy? And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? Which is a very ominous and beautiful line. What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born, right? So he's asking us this question is, where do we go from here? And that's very reminiscent of kind of popular depictions of the Antichrist figure being born as a baby, and Bethlehem, of course, being the city where Christ was born. So this poem, just right at our first reading, is a description of the world, and here we are 100 years after it was written, and it's pretty darn relevant. Or I don't know about you, but I definitely feel pretty relatable to this poem, right? It does seem like, oh man, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The best are lacking all conviction. Why aren't things getting better? And we just might have a little different metaphor for this beast. So let's start thinking poetically. So I'm going to switch up my comic color. Let's do level 2, be blue. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. So I'm debating, there's so much you could dive into here, right? Turning and turning, you have repetition, widening, you have this repetition of the suffix, ing, right? Repetition of the suffix, and suffix, right? A little bit of a word at the end that you can add on or take off. Turns a verb into a noun typically. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, right? And we kind of have a slant rhyme here. So a slant rhyme is where two things don't rhyme completely. I'll do slant rhyme, gyre and falconer, right? Typically we're looking for these what are called end rhymes here. But you also get internal rhymes, falcon, falconer, right? But it's also just repetition. So I'm not going to mark, I mean, some of the stuff is just so obvious. Things fall apart, semicolon, the center cannot hold, semicolon, mere anarchy. So punctuation, that's not even a poetic thing. Well, it is, but I'm just curious about it. Curious about the punctuation. So when you are annotating your own poems, as you will in our next module next week, this is all the same stuff you can, right? So we're looking for things like rhyming and punctuation, but some of the stuff might not be so obvious, right? We totally skipped over this idea of the falcon, right? And what does the falcon metaphorically or symbolize? Falcon symbolic of, right? And that's, and again, I could take a guess, but falcon symbol. Let's just take a look. Agility, ascension, determination, inspiration, focus, grace, mental speed, prophecy, freedom, swiftness, purpose, movement, and healing, right? So these are all positive attributes. And here they are getting further and further away, right? Symbolic of positive things, freedom, right? Movement. What were some of the other things? Even prophecy, kind of ironic there. Let's see if I could spell right. I know how to spell. Prophecy, all moving away, right? The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. We have a couple cool things here. So a couple terms you might notice on your list are the terms assonance and consonants. So let's look at a little assonance here. Assonance is a repetition of vowel sounds. So here we have loosed, whirled, hold, blood, loosed again, drowned, oni, osins, right? We have this repetition of the O sound, repetition of the O sound, and what that does, I mean, it's probably on purpose. We have to assume a lot of this stuff is on purpose. Poets tend not to accidentally write poems. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed and everywhere the ceremony, right? And it kind of gives it this ominous feel. Oh, is this very, it's a sound that makes you have to pause on it and, right, give it a certain amount of weight. So I'm gonna see if I can stop my clock from checking here. So I'm gonna say a repetition of O sound gives the poem an ominous feeling and forces us to read slow, right? You can't just, the blood-dimmed tide is loose. The blood-dimmed tide is loose, right? It doesn't sound like anything if you try to read it fast. It forces you to slow down here. Best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I'm sure there's more here, especially with sound, repetition. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. And I think, right, these are two biblical references. And in the Bible, they don't use exclamation points, at least not in the traditional, Hebrew that a lot of it was written in, or Greek, I assume, or Aramaic. So instead of exclamation points, when something's important, they repeat it. And here we have that right here. So repetition off the top, and if I could learn how to spell, this would be a little bit easier. Repetition off the top. The second coming, hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus moody troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. So let's think about some of the things going on here. Surely, second coming, spiritus mundi, sand, sight, shape, vast words. So a lot of, so here's the other side. There's assonance and there's consonants, right? So consonants is repetition of, goodness, repetition, repetition of a consonant. Sound. So S here, surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out from the vast image out of spiritism, right? So repetition of the consonant sound S in this top of this stanza. S sound. And what's that do? I mean, it forces you, right? You have that surely, some. S is very like hissy and aggressive. And I think it's kind of ominous too. There's a, right, if you think like Harry Potter, when the snakes talk, they speak in partial tongue. It's just a lot of S and H sounds. So I think authors kind of know what the effects of different sounds sound like here. Chosen my sight, somewhere in the sands of the desert. His shape with lion body and head of a man. The gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. Okay, so something I'm going back and I'm noticing, and this is something we probably could have looked up at the top, right? Let's count syllables. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. That's 12. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Those two are 10 each. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. 10, 10, 10. The blood dim tide is loosed and everywhere. 10. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. 11. The best lack all conviction, while the worst 10 are full of passionate intensity. 10. So this is written in what's called a pentameter. So not a word you need to know, but pentameter, penta, right, meaning 5 because there's 5, right, 2 beats, so 10 total. Pentameter mostly, and I think right, it's all the lines in here except I think 2 in the first stanza are written in pentameter, but 2 lines are not in pentameter, and that makes it so we cannot get comfortable, right? We think of Shakespeare. Shakespeare writes almost exclusively in pentameter, right? You think his love poems and whatnot, and it's really nice, right? Shakespeare is said to write in pentameter because it sounds most closely to a human heartbeat. Bum 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 bum. And here, Yates isn't letting you get comfortable in your nice love poem-esque style. He's doing it for a couple lines, and then he's going to throw a curveball at you to say, no, 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 this is not a love poem, right? This is, you should be unsettled. It's like your heart is skipping a beat. So that is a cool little thing he must have been paying attention to here. So that's another thing I always recommend is counting the syllables in each line. And here, if we really want to, there's 8 lines here, and let me guess, there's going to be what, 12 or 13 lines here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 16 lines here. So 24 lines total. Does that mean anything? Maybe not. These blanket real shadows of indignant desert birds. indignant desert birds. So when we have a lot of kind of harsh sounds, you should be able to see on your little poetry word sounds. That's called a like cacophony or cacophonic. And that's just right. Caco is a little prefix meaning ugly. So here we are. It's a cacophony of sounds here, which kind of makes sense because it's also the sounds of birds. Indignant desert birds, the darkness drops again, right? D is this very slappy, hard sound. And so if we want to say like consonants again for the D there. Same thing down here, the 20 centuries of stony sleep. And now we're kind of lulled back. So the opposite of cacophony is euphony. That EU right there is a prefix meaning beautiful. And it kind of sounds like a lullaby, right? The 20 centuries of stony sleep is really nice, pleasant sounding there. And then we get this word vexed, which is such a harsh and ugly sound there. Vexed. I believe it just means confused, but this is one that might be worth looking up as well. Annoyed, frustrated, worry. Annoyed. I think frustrated here is a good one, right? Because it says maybe this thing, this nightmare, didn't want to happen, right? And so if we're kind of going back to the World War I metaphor that this poem might be responding to, this turn of events, right? The blood-dimmed tide, the ceremony of innocence being drowned, right? And I love that verb for this, right? Literally having its head shoved underwater till it dies. And right, that's the concept of innocence. And you can think because the war isn't fought by heroes, the wars typically tend to be fought by boys, by children, right? And they see their friends die and their families die, and it's an ugly, horrible thing. And we should never glamorize warfare. And I think Yates, who I believe was in the Navy, it's been a while since we did this because we started this back in January and it's July right now. Right, so vexed to nightmare. And again, that would be cacophonic. And what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born, right? And again, that slouching shows a certain, I don't want to do this, right? Maybe your parents yell at you, oh, stop slouching toward Bethlehem. And it's this inevitability. So if we're going maybe with a tone, that's definitely a poetic thing, tone of inevitability, right? It's like when your alarm goes off in the morning and you want to stay in bed, but oh geez, I have to get up. So there we go. So, and of course we're missing out on things. Again, we could have talked about punctuation. We could have talked about little internal rhyming. We could have talked about metaphor, right? This idea of the lion body, the lion representing power, pride. Well, the man representing maybe intelligence, but maybe also cruelty, maybe also certain holiness. The lion representing maybe God. I don't know, right? You can dig into it, and it's poetry. So kind of whatever ideas you have aren't going to be wrong. So finally, let's get to the being and unbeing here. The first thing here, the falcon, let's choose a different color for being and unbeing. Let's go purple for being and unbeing. So this is that level 3. So being and unbeing, we'll just kind of pick apart when we see it. So turning and turning, winding, gyre, falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So that's just telling me like communication. Like, why did things fall apart? It's because people stopped talking to each other. The two things that should be talking, the falcon, the falconer, are breaking up a little bit. Communication breakdown. Breakdown can lead to collapse. But on the other hand, and here's if you want to get a little bit fancy with it. So this would be, right, maybe unbeing. But being is like the falcon is going out on its, if I can see that, its own. And I think there's a certain power structure here the falcon is disrupting, right? The falcon at the end of the day is just a tool for the falconer. And here the falcon is taking its own chains and breaking them. So maybe the falcon is being, and you know what? There are certain systems set up by the powerful that the falcon is disrupting. And for the powerful, it looks like, oh no, the world is ending. Wow, like I can't have a servant anymore. I don't have this falcon. And right, obviously the falcon would be a representation of the common man, the working class, the proletariat, right? And here it is breaking free, and the rich, the powerful, can only imagine that as being the end of the world. So, right, if we're kind of inserting a positionality there, we could say the falcon is being, going out on its own, seizing its own destiny. And that's, that's kind of cool. Things fall apart, center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, right? So anarchy just allows opportunity for people to show who they really are, right? It's easy to say that, oh, this group of people is being because they're successful. Look at all, they must have done everything right in life because they have the fancy car and live in the nice neighborhood or whatever. They must be being, and all the people who ride on the bus are unbeing. But that's not the case, right? Because that eliminates whole conversations around the lives you're born into, privilege and all that. But anarchy as a concept, right, is the absence of government, right? Anna means separate, archy is like a ruling structure. So we're separated from the ruling structure. And people are just people. And when people are just people, you get to see who they actually are. So I'd say that kind of sounds like being to me. I don't know. The ceremony of innocence is drowned, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. And here again, I'm going to be skeptical, right? When we're giving value judgments like best or worst, who says who is the best or the worst, right? If we're thinking of two countries in a war, you're going to view your own side as the best, and you're going to view the enemies as the worst, right? And this sounds like they might have been losing the war. But throughout history, we've always had groups put into the best and worst categories when we know for a fact the only reason they're put there is because it benefits the people in power, right? Either as a scapegoat or just for straight up hatred. So I'm a little skeptical of that line. So I'm going to say maybe a little bit of unbeing. Revelation is at hand, second coming is at hand. Hardly are those words out when the vast image of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of indignant desert birds. Darkness drops again. So we have a certain question here: is prophecy being or unbeing? And maybe it's how this information gets used. Right, and maybe it has to do with the gaze blank and pitiless, right? Being without pity is unbeing, because you're not considering others. Pitiless equals unbeing, right? I always think of the famous line from Lord of the Rings, or maybe it was The Hobbit, right? Where Gandalf, no, it would have been Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf is talking to Frodo and Frodo says, oh, you should have just killed Gollum in the cave. Well, you could have. And Gandalf says it was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand, right? So pity has a usefulness. I know people always say like, oh, don't pity me, but if you're experiencing this feeling of pity, you are considering others, and pity equals considering others, at least to some degree, right? It could be patronizing, but it could be maybe the opening the door to empathy. And empathy is definitionally, right, being, right? The darkness drops again, 20 centuries of stony sleep reflects nightmare by a rocking cradle. And it depends on how you want to take this metaphor, right? But the cradle representing a new thing being born, this change, and being, and you could probably talk to your parents, grandparents, whoever about this, is when you're old, all change seems bad or scary, right? And not for everyone, but we've definitely seen enough change in the last 200 years, right? That when change happens, people use it to fearmonger, to create dissension. And maybe a little bit that's the case what's going on here, right? Oh, things are changing. It must be a literal, end of the world antichrist thing, right? And what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. And let's see, being and unbeing. If we had to answer the question, what would Yeats say being is? Let's just do that. Being to Yeats is seeing how awful things can get and choosing to live despite, right? So, and that's, I'm kind of taking it from here. The best lack all conviction is, how do you keep your convictions, I guess? Keep your convictions, right? Conviction is just this feeling of doing the right thing. Where unbeing, and I'll just write it here, unbeing to Yeats is going along with, I'm going to say, despair. And if you're familiar with different, philosophers, Kierkegaard talks a lot about this. Yates is going along with despair, and despair is this little death, right? You're allowing yourself to die. You're giving up hope before you ever had it. Going along with despair, drowning your conviction. And this is an easy thing to do, right? It's always easier to do unbeing. And you might remember that with the E.E. Cummings piece, that it's always easier just to go along and unbe and go about other people's business. And here Yates is kind of talking about the same thing. He's, you could just sit around and watch, or you could pick up your convictions and do something about it. And of course, this is all has to do kind of in the context implicitly of warfare and violence. So we're going to actually have to do some work to take it back out into the real day-to-day world. But maybe it's not too far off. So hopefully that was helpful. I know that was probably a bit longer than you expected, than I expected, but it's a dense poem. When you're going through and reading the roots, they're almost certainly not going to be this dense. A lot of the stuff will be pretty straightforward. You're just going to have to, I recommend doing the Google searches that we're going to show you in next week's module. So hopefully that was helpful. Have a great day. Make sure you reach out to your teacher with any questions. I really like this style of annotation. Hopefully you did as well. And we're going to end it there.